And while we were there was a knock on the door, and two men came in, and they drew guns, and they asked if she was Rita Gerst, and she said yes. And they said, "You want to see her ID?" And she gave it to them. And they started to, it looked like they were taking her away.
You're listening to Code Red with Secure America Now, the largest national security grassroots army.
Hello and welcome to the Code Red podcast. My name is Matthew, filling in for Alan Roth on this very special edition of the Code Red podcast. Today, in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we have on Stephanie Douglas-Furman, a Holocaust survivor who has agreed to come on and share her story with us and our audience. Stephanie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And so let's start off, just jump right into it. Can you give me some background on yourself? Maybe where you were, when you were born, some things like that?
Absolutely. I was born in Wuppertal, Elberfeld, which is in Germany, the northwestern part of Germany. The year was 1936.
Okay, awesome. And so I'm curious, obviously, you grew up in Germany. You started out actually in Germany, rather.
Right.
So tell me a little bit about, your experience. What was it like growing up during the Holocaust?
I remember growing up in Germany. I still have quite a few recollections of my time in Germany. I remember the apartment my mother and I occupied. I remember visiting my father in prison and being around 4 years old. I could not understand why I couldn't have him walk out with us. I grew up as a kid, and I don't remember any problem at that stage in my life.
So at what point did you first realize the severity of, what was going on around you? How old were you at the time?
Well, the first problem that we encountered, apparently, I understand that my mother was on the Gestapo's most wanted list. And so she was due to go back to prison. She had been imprisoned previously for being a member of the Communist Party. And I guess she decided to leave Germany and hired an agent to get us across the border. It isn't like you can just walk across. We had to sneak across because there was a lot of barbed wire. And it was the middle of the night. And I remember being all excited because I got to stay up late. We did it at night. Normally I would be sleeping at that time. So I remember walking and talking, being all excited, and then hearing a motor in the distance. It turned out there was somebody, a guard, I guess, on a motorcycle. And the agent, because I was talking, knocked me down on the ground, and I didn't peep. I knew that if I started to howl or cry because I was thrown down, it would be bad. So I stayed very quiet, and the motorcycle passed, did not see us. And I remember walking a long, long time. And eventually, when dawn came, we were in Holland.
Were you there for the duration of the war?
No, about 6 months, I think.
And where did you end up after that?
My mother arranged to meet with her sister, who was living in Belgium with her family, her husband and 2 sons.
Okay, and what year did you guys get to Belgium?
I was Belgium about 1941.
Okay. So I'm curious, were you ever yourself, were you ever captured by the Nazis, imprisoned by the Nazis?
No, uh, my mother was, and I was there when she was. Uh, my mother had apparently found a place where we could be safe because she was wanted and there were posters out for her arrest. And we were on our way to this place, which must have been on a farm someplace. And she went to visit some people that she knew before we were going there, before we went there. And while we were there was a knock on the door, and two men came in, and they drew guns, and they asked if she was Rita Gerst, and she said yes. And they said they want to see her ID, and she gave it to them. And they started to, it looked like they were taking her away. At that point, I howled and tried to kick them and try to stop it. I knew they were taking her away, and I couldn't do anything. And the people that we were visiting grabbed me, put me on, made me stand on a chair, and held my legs so I couldn't kick anymore. And they took my mother.
Was that the last time you saw her?
Yes. And then the people there, it was a man and a wife, and they were trying to figure out what to do with me. So I ran out the door. I ran out and went out the door and started wandering in the streets, trying to find my aunt, my mother's sister. And luckily, I found her. I was able to find her. And I told her about my mother. And it was really difficult because all Jews were being deported. If they had to sew stars of David on their clothes so they could be easily identified. And it was always risky. And so my aunt, a couple of days later, brought me to an orphanage in Belgium.
And is that where you spent the duration of the years during the war?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And can you tell me anything about your father? I know you said you visited him in prison when you were 4 years old or whatever. Can you tell me a little bit more about him?
Yes. He was arrested when apparently I was 6 months old at the time. Of course, that's not something I remember. But he was arrested, and he was, because he was a communist, that was his, I guess that was his crime. And at the time, they rounded up quite a few, my aunt said about 100 people from the Communist Party. And out of those, 96%, 96 of them, I should say, were executed. And 4 were able to get a prison sentence. And my father was one of the 4 that was able to get a prison sentence instead of being executed at the time. But I only saw him once, and that was in prison.
And so after prison, did he end up do you know if he ended up in a concentration camp, or you're not too sure about what happened after that?
No, well, I was with my mother. My mother brought me there. She went to visit him and took me. So we both went. And it was after that that my mother realized that she was going to get arrested. And at the end of my father's prison, he got a 4-year prison sentence, apparently. And at the end of that time, because he was Jewish, instead of releasing him, they sent him to Auschwitz. And he survived the entire war till the Russians were at the city gates and were coming into the city, and there was a forced march, and he couldn't walk anymore, and he was shot at that point.
Wow. I'm curious, whatever happened with your aunt that you were telling me about, that you, after your mother was arrested, you ended up running and finding her?
What happened? She survived the war. So did her husband and one of her two sons. She had two sons. And she would have me come over with her on weekends from time to time from the orphanage. And she survived, but her son the Nazis would just pick people up in the street and get their information and have them report at a place where they could be put on rail cars and deported to Germany. So he was 16 at the time, and I remember being with my aunt at the time in her apartment, and they were arguing because my aunt wanted to give him some food, and all she had to give him were plums. So she insisted that he takes the plums because he's going to be hungry. They're not going to feed him. And he didn't want it. He felt there's no point because he felt he didn't need it. And so he left the plums. But he went to the place where he was told to meet, and they deported him, and nobody ever saw him again.
I'm curious, do you have any positive memories from this period in your life? For example, any kind strangers that hid you along the way, any friends that you made in the orphanage, anything like that?
Well, yeah. There were, I think the census of the orphanage was about 50. And I was lucky, they had two classrooms, and the first one was from kindergarten through third grade, and the second classroom was like fourth through the sixth grade. After that, they went to a higher school and had to go out. But I was sent into kindergarten since I was about, probably, I was still 5 at the time. I had no problem with the kids. I was the youngest there, and I started kindergarten. And because I was sitting with the first graders, I did their work too, so they decided to put me in first grade. And a few months into it, they took me out of school. And the reason was, I didn't find that out till later, was because I was Jewish, and the Germans had forbidden Jewish children from being educated. And my aunt, not knowing that the orphanage was already putting me in school because they didn't know I was Jewish, came to beg them to let me continue, to let me get an education. And because they were, at risk if they disobeyed the German edict, they took me out of school. And I was taken out of the classroom, and there were 6 other kids with a similar fate. And that was the first time that I heard that I was Jewish, and I had absolutely no idea what Jewish meant.
Wow. Looking back all these years later, what has been the longest lasting impact of growing up during the Holocaust?
Well, I remember when the Germans were defeated, and all the bells rang, and everybody was celebrating in Belgium. I was still in the orphanage. All of the bells rang, and everybody was happy because everybody was frightened of the Germans. When you walked down the street, you made sure that if you saw a soldier, a German soldier, you crossed the street. You wanted to stay away from them because they could shoot you. You knew that you were not safe, that they could do anything they wanted. And that was very frightening. So when we go someplace, we would avoid running into people. It was, you kind of have to protect yourself. But when the armistice came, I cried because I knew instinctively that I would never see my parents again. I knew that if we hadn't connected, that they would never be there again.
And so you talk about the armistice and, the German defeat. Can you tell me a little bit about your life after the war?
Yeah. I was sent to a convent, a Catholic convent. I think they were the only ones that actually had food left after the war, because the Germans took back to Germany everything that wasn't nailed down. They helped themselves to everything. And so the Catholic Church, the nuns, I guess they had some gardens and land that they cultivated, and they ate. And so I was in there, and I spent 6 months there, learned the catechism, the Catholic doctrine. I can say Hail Mary in French. The nuns were very strict, but they were okay. So were the people in the orphanage, though I often got into trouble because I was too loud. I was surrounded by the people from Belgium who were always very nice and very kind. There was nothing especially mean about them. But the Germans, yes, whenever I saw any kind of newsreel, it was nothing but the horrors of what was going on with the prisoners that the Germans had taken.
So I know you're in the United States and you ended up in the United States after the war, correct?
Yeah. Well, first, yeah, my aunt came to me. I was after spending several months in the convent. My aunt took me out, and apparently the Jewish organizations had, I think it was called Joint. They were gathering all of the orphans that they could, and they had set up orphanages. And I was in one of the orphanages, and it was a chateau. I think it was an 18th century chateau in the countryside of Belgium, in a little town called Provençal. It was a lovely place, and I spent 3 years there. And at the end of the 3 years, my aunt came to me and she said, "You have family in America, and they want you to go and live with them." And my answer, I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to come to the United States. But she said, if you go with me, they were going to emigrate to Israel. And she says, I don't know, you're going to be in an orphanage, or you're going to be in a kibbutz. I don't know if I can take you to live with me. But if you go to America, you'll live with a family in a home. And I still wasn't convinced. And the reason that they went to that they were going to Israel, they had originally wanted to go to America, and my uncle was converting Belgian currency into dollars. So when he came to the States, he would have some cash. He couldn't work. He had to work in the black market during the war. But afterwards, when the Germans were defeated, he got regular employment, and he tried to convert it into dollars. But one day, his remaining son came home, and he said, I'm going to Israel next weekend. There's a boat leaving the harbor, and I'm going to be on it. And I don't know if you remember that part of history, but there was a boat in 1948 that was trying to reach Israel and get in, and it wasn't allowed. I think the British would not allow it to enter the harbor, and my cousin was on that boat. And so eventually the boat did dock, and they did go to Israel, and my aunt and uncle followed him later. But I was still talking, when I talked to my aunt about going to America, I said to her, I still wasn't convinced that I wanted to go, and she didn't want to force me. So I said, well, do they have a dog? And she said, oh, yes. And she didn't have a clue, but she thought it would be a better decision for me, a better place for me to be going to the United States than to go to Israel, which was still having a lot of problems as a country to get organized, as you probably know.
Absolutely.
And so I came to the United States because they had a dog, which they didn't, but they got one. They got one shortly thereafter, and that's it.
I'll finish off here with one last question for you. Obviously, the Holocaust is, many, many years in the past, generations come and go. So I'm just curious, if you could say anything to the next generation, that might not be so familiar with the atrocities of the Holocaust or just the Holocaust in general, what would you like to, what's the message you'd like to get out there?
Don't ever forget it, because it can repeat.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a great way to leave off, honestly. So I will say this, Stephanie, I really appreciate the time. I thank you very much for coming on the program, and I wish you all the best, and I really do appreciate your story.
Matthew, thank you, and I hope someday to meet you in person.
I hope so as well. Take care, and have a good one.
You too. Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to the Code Red Podcast. Be sure to click subscribe to stay up to date and be the first to hear about our future podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Code Red Podcast on Podbean, Spotify, Google Play, and YouTube.